And if you would also please open up your Bibles to Numbers chapter 11. Or if you brought the story with you, you can open it up to page number 71. Page number 71. Today we are in chapter 6 of the story. And if you were here last week, then you remember that we learned that the Israelites and Moses, they were camping at the base of Mount Sinai, and they were there for an entire year. And during that time, Moses received the law that he was to deliver to the people. And remember, he was up on the mountain for 40 days hearing all the stuff that he was to declare to the people. And among the stuff that he was listening to, he got the 10 Commandments that God wrote on the 2 stone tablets and that he was to deliver to the people. Last week, we learned that God's authority is for our good. And I hope that you understand that and appreciate that as we're studying God's laws and we're reading God's Word, it's for our good. God did not put these boundaries in place to make us suffer. He did not give us these laws to hurt us or to limit us. These laws, these boundaries, these guardrails were given by God for our benefit, for our blessing. And I hope that you've grabbed hold of that last week and you understand that. We learned last week that the first 4 commandments that God gave, that those 4 commandments were given to us to help us enhance our relationship with God the Father. It was supposed to work on our vertical relationship with Him. I mean, if you look at those first 4 commands, those were given so that our relationship with God, our Creator, would be better. And it's going to be better if you don't have any other gods but God, and you don't say His name in vain or casually. And if you remember the Sabbath and keep it holy as the Lord's day, your relationship with Him will be enhanced greatly. And then we learned that the next 6 commandments were given so that we could experience enhanced relationship with one another. That's our horizontal relationships. Our relationships with our spouse, our children, our neighbors, our coworkers. If we follow these 6 commandments, those relationships will be enhanced. They'll be better because we're learning that I'm supposed to honor our mom and our dad. Okay, I'm supposed to not lie against my neighbor or to steal from them or to commit adultery on my wife. If I commit myself to following and doing these 6 commandments, it's going to enhance my relationships with those around me. Well, in the story chapter 6, we learn that the people, the Israelites, are done camping at the base of Mount Sinai, and God is charging the people, He's charging Moses to go ahead and get ready to lead them to the land that was intended for them to be lived in, the promised land. And so today I want to review a little bit from the story chapter 6. The story chapter 6. If you did your reading, and it looks like a lot of us are, and I'm so thrilled, I hope that continues to be the case week after week, that we're reading through this. But if you did your reading, it opens up with an all too familiar scene at the bottom of page 71. It's the last paragraph on page 71, actually, and it opens up this way. It says, "The people complained about their hardships." Surprise, surprise, right? As we've been reading the story of the Israelites, from the time they've left Egypt, it seems like the only thing that these people are doing is complaining about how horrible life is for them, right? And once again, they're not happy. In fact, we learned, first of all, that they're complaining about M&M, is what I've listed it in your bulletin. And no, it's not, whether we want plain or peanut, okay? They're talking about meat and manna. The people, for all this time, God has provided manna for them. And we learned last week that manna was like this bread-like thing that God gave to them. It was I think the Bible describes it as fine as frost, is what it describes it as. It was like a bread thing that tasted rather sweet. And they were complaining because they had this to eat each and every day, all day, every day, right? And so this is what's interesting. The Bible doesn't name names. It collectively refers to the group of complainers as the rabble. The rabble. That's who the Bible refers to, those people who are complaining. And isn't that how it is today? If you go to churches and you'll hear little groups of people complaining, and usually, we don't really know who those people are. We just hear the murmurers, and, well, somebody said to me, and they didn't like, and somebody told me, and we never really name names. It's just like that murmuring in the corner of people who are complaining about stuff they don't like, right? And how sad it has to be for God's people to find themselves constantly complaining about things they don't like. And so a little self-evaluation here this morning. As you look at yourself and you were to honestly evaluate, are you known or are you characterized as a person who's constantly complaining about the stuff you don't like rather than rejoicing in the stuff that you have and that God has given to you? So the people are complaining, we have manna, we're sick of manna, we want meat. Well, God gives them meat. In fact, so much meat that the Israelites would soon get sick of that. And I preached a sermon on this not too long ago before we started the story, but you remember me talking about Quail-mageddon? God providing these quail, 3 feet deep of quail for 12 miles in any one direction. Okay, that's a lot of quail. It tells us that there was so much quail that it took the millions and millions of Israelites who were there 2 days to gather it all. That's a lot of quail. So God tells the Israelites that he was going to provide for them a land that is flowing with milk and honey. And after quail and after manna, well, a land flowing with milk and honey, that sounded pretty good. They welcomed the change, and the people were all in favor of it. So Moses sends out some spies to the land of Canaan, right? That's what he does. All right, trivia. How many spies were there? How many? 12, right? So we have 12 spies that Moses sent out. Why 12? Well, because there were 12 tribes, and each selected a spy from each of the 12 tribes that were going to represent each of the 12 tribes that were there, and he sends them to the land of Canaan. And he gives them some very specific things to look for, some things that he wanted them to observe. Numbers chapter 13, starting in verse 17, says this. When Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, he said to them, "Go up there to Negev, then go up to the hill country, see what the land is like, and whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many. How is the land in which they live? Is it good or bad? And how are the cities in which they live? Are they open like camps, or do they have fortification? How is the land? Is it fat or lean? Are the trees in it or not? Make an effort then to get some of the fruit of the land." Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. All right, some more quiz. How long were the spies gone for? 40 days, right? And if you did your reading, you know that 40 days is going to be significant here in just a little bit, okay? So the spies finally get back after being gone for 40 days, spying out the land, and they give Moses the report. And these 12 men come back to Moses and Aaron and their tribes, and they report what they've seen and what they've experienced. And one more trivia question. What did the 12 spies have with them? What was it? Grapes. Well done. A cluster of grapes, right? Here's a sample of some of the delicious fruit that was there from the land. By the way, that's why the front of your bulletin has a cluster of grapes on it this morning, to remind you of the blessings that can be yours if you obediently do what God has told you to do. Okay? So these 12 men, they report, and what do they have to say? Well, let's read about that now in Numbers chapter 13, verses 27 through 29. Thus they told them and said, "We went into the land where you sent us, and it was certainly flowing with milk and honey." By the way, just like God said it would. "And this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are well fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and all along the side of the Jordan." Now, why do they mention all those guys? Because those are all people who they're going to have to evacuate out of the land if they want to occupy the land. Those are the people who are inhabiting the land. So they're listing all the enemies, all of the nations who are living there in that area, and that had them shaken a little bit. But there were 2 men out of the 12 who stood up and did what was right. And we know them as, I heard one of them, Joshua, Caleb, right? Joshua and Caleb were the 2 men out of the 12 who actually said, yeah, we can do this. We should move in towards the land to what God has given us. And let's read about that in Numbers chapter 13, verses 30 through 33. So Caleb quiets the people before Moses and says, "We should by all means go up and take possession of this land, for we will surely overcome them. But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go against the people, for they are too strong for us." So they gave all the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone in spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are of great size." There were also Nephilim, the sons of Anak are also part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Let me quickly talk to you a little bit about what the Nephilim are. They're first mentioned in Genesis, right? And what was happening were these Nephilim, the sons of, and a lot of people believe that these Nephilim were actually fallen angels. You remember that whole thing that kicked out of heaven? Couldn't be in heaven anymore because of the rebellion that happened, Satan, and these were all fallen angels who were having sexual relations with women, human beings. And so the offspring of such is a mixture of an angelic being and a human being, and they were giants. Okay, and the Bible records this in several places that this is what the Nephilim were. Okay, another piece of trivia for you: can you name the 10 spies who gave the bad report? Can you name one? Me either. Here's the lesson with that: history is going to record those who are obedient and doing what God asks them to do. Okay. History is, those men are the only ones who history remembers, are the ones who follow the plans of the Lord. So they hear this report, and fear strikes the hearts of the Israelites upon the bad report that they received by the majority, and so they make the decision, and the decision is not to go enter into the promised land that God's told them to take. They're like, "Oh, it's too hard, we can't do it." In fact, listen to their whining. It's unbelievable. Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept all night. And all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron and the whole congregation, and said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" And so they said to one another, get this, "Let us appoint another leader and return to Egypt." You ever hear the phrase, "careful what you wish for"? Well, they're about to get what they wish for. You want to die in this wilderness? Fine, have at it. You'll get just that. In fact, God delivers the news of what the outcome is going to be. And he tells them very plainly that they were going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Why 40 years? Remember how I told you the spies were gone for 40 days? The reason that they were doomed to wander in the wilderness for 40 years was because they wanted to spend 1 year of wandering for every day that the spies were gone. And so it begins. For 40 years, the nation of God remained nationless. They remained nomads in the wilderness. No walls, no permanent dwellings, always on the move. And for 40 years they wandered until that generation of just whiners and complainers and all the people who didn't want to enter into the promised land, until they all died. And eventually something happens that was really stupid on the part of Moses. You see, the people were thirsty again. They're in the desert after all. And once again, God tells Moses that he will provide the water. But this time, he tells Moses he's going to provide the water if Moses will speak to the rock. Water would come out of it. But what does Moses do instead? What's he do? He hits it, right? How many times does he hit the rock? Twice. 2 times he hits the rock, right? And that act of disobedience, his lack of trust in God, we're going to talk about that in just a second, would prevent Moses from seeing the promised land. So now we get to the end of this week's chapter. The end of chapter 6, and I've titled this part the passing of the torch, and then the passing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because God tells Moses that his time on earth is drawing to a close, and so Moses is to anoint someone who is going to come after him, the second leader of the nation of Israel, and that he was going to eventually die and not see the promised land. And who was it that was going to be in charge of the people after Moses died? It was none other than Joshua, right? One of the two spies who gave the good report. Joshua is going to be the one who's going to be in charge now of the nation of Israel. And we're going to talk more about Joshua's leadership next week. You're going to read about that in the story chapter 7 next week. But for now, I want us to get down to what matters in this story. I want to talk a little bit about the application, because if there isn't an application to the story that I've just told you, if the story that we've just covered and read this week doesn't apply to our lives, and if we can't learn kind of methods and methodologies from it, then I've told you nothing other than a bedtime story that's about, 11 hours too early, okay? And so now we want to talk a little bit and get some application. Here's the application I want to make from today's story, and that is this: what to do while wandering. What to do while wandering. The Israelites, we've already determined, wandered in the desert for 40 years. 1 year for every day the spies were gone. And you and I want you to make you aware of this morning, that you and I, whether you know it or not, we're wandering as well. Okay? Let me tell you what I mean when I say wander. I'll give you a definition here. Wandering is living in the space between where I started and where I want to be. Okay? It's living in the space from where I started and where I want to end up. That's kind of the wandering and how I'm going to get there. And it may take a long time to end up getting to where I want to get. And so we're wandering. And I would dare say that there isn't a person in this room who is exactly where they want to be in regards to life. Nobody would look at their life and say, yep, I've arrived. Nobody would say that, because we are imperfect people. And so we're talking about the space in between from where we started to where we're going to end up. And as we look back to where we've been, we can be like, yeah, I'm making progress, okay? But I've still got a ways to go. And so we're all wandering. How many of you men are the kind of husband and the kind of father you want to be? How many of you are like, yeah, I'm father of the year. I've got that nailed, right? Or how many of us are the kind of spouse that we need to be to our wives? And hopefully, and to our husbands. Hopefully we're learning. The longer we've been married, we're getting better at it. We're remembering anniversaries. We're remembering what makes them happy. We're giving the right gifts, right? We're getting better at it, but we haven't arrived yet. And how about your relationship with the Lord? Are you a stronger Christian than you were 10 years ago? Well, yeah, there's some things I feel like I've got a hold of, a grasp of, but man, I've got a long ways to go because I'm nowhere where I need to be. And so I want you to see that we are all wandering. But as we wander, there are some lessons to be learned. It was the summer after, the spring break of my senior year of Bible college. Lindsay and I, we were just newlyweds, and we decided that we had two other couples who were really good friends of ours. And in fact, Mark Bond and Rachel Bond that is Wayne and Becky Humphrey's daughter and his son-in-law. They were with us, and we decided, we had another couple, Matt and Monica Worstel. He's minister down now in Quincy. It was our spring break of my senior year of Bible college. We decided for spring break, we wanted to do something kind of fun. We were all newlyweds. We were kind of like, let's go do something. So we decided on a whim that we were going to drive from Moberly, Missouri down to Orlando, Florida and go to Disney World. Anybody here ever been to Disney World? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you're about as impressed as I was then, right? Okay, totally, the destination was not worth the trip, right? In my mind, anyway. This is another great thing. Mark Bond had just purchased this minivan. It was a 1985 minivan. He got it for $600. So we all load up in this thing, not a lot of room, and we'd set off for this adventure. And here's the one thing I learned about that trip, and maybe this is where you're at in life as well, that a lot of times the trip is about the journey, right? Yeah, and sometimes when we're kids and we don't understand, we're like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? How much longer? And we totally miss out on the fact that sometimes the journey, or the trip is about the journey, about getting there. And I want to learn some lessons here this morning. In fact, the title of this morning's message is Wandering with Purpose. And so as you were focused on getting to where we need to be, let's not miss out on the fact that we are journeying towards the goal, okay? And there's some things that we need to learn and some lessons that we can experience along the way. And here's the first lesson that I want us to remember as we're journeying towards our destination, okay? And that is this: Get some perspective. Get some perspective. Isn't it true that the older we get, the better our perspective is, generally speaking? Those of you who've lived a little bit longer than I have, you probably have got great wisdom and understanding that, you know what? Yeah, life is full of ups and downs. But sometimes in the middle of life, when things are not the way we'd like them to be, our perspective gets skewed pretty quickly. And we become focused on the wrong things. I mean, that was certainly true of the Israelites, right? Give us manna. We're sick of manna. Give us meat, whining and complaining when they really needed to get some perspective about the manna they were given. They forgot that God provided them food every single day while they were in the desert to eat. And what usually ends up happening when we don't have the right perspective on things is that we get the facts mixed up. You ever been guilty of that? When, you're focused on the bad, negative stuff of your life and you can't see past the pain that you're experiencing, and you get facts mixed up real quickly. Listen to the complaints of the Israelites back in Numbers chapter 11 at the beginning of the story. It says this, starting in verse 4. The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, but now our appetite is gone. There's nothing to look at except this manna. Well, first of all, no Israelite was eating cucumbers and melons and leeks and garlics in the land of Egypt. They were slaves. They're not getting food that was on the tables of kings, okay? Let's get that fact straight, first of all. Secondly, manna is better than starving. Bread provided from God that you don't have to really go out and work for too hard except gather it and put it in your mouth and eat it and put it in your belly. That's a whole lot better than starving. And so the rabble needs to go ahead and get some perspective, needs to really see facts for what they are. And maybe that's the lesson for you today. That maybe in the wandering that you're going through, as maybe you find yourself complaining and being vocal about things that you're just not happy about, maybe you need to get some perspective and see that things could certainly be a whole lot worse. I listened on Friday morning to James MacDonald, and his sermon on Friday morning, it was interesting. He was talking about complaining. And James MacDonald is exactly right. He said this. He said, complaining is a sin. We don't often think of it as a sin, but complaining is a sin. Did you know that? And the reason that it's a sin is because it's an affront to God. It's basically saying, God, you're not good enough for me, and what you've given me is not good enough, and what you've provided for me is not good enough. It's a dissatisfaction with something that isn't a sin. That's what complaining is. And that's basically saying, God, your hand of provision is not what I need in this moment. And that's a sin. And so if you find yourself complaining, first of all, get some perspective and get the facts right. Don't be fooled by false romanticized memories of the good old days, because the good old days weren't as good as you probably think they were, okay? Here's the second lesson that we learn as we wander through life. The first is get some perspective. Here's the second. Get past the fear. Get past the fear. I mean, what was the reason the Israelites didn't want to enter into the land of promise that God told them about? It's because of fear. They were scared about the inhabitants in the land. Man, they're giants. We can't defeat them. And did you notice the comparison that they made? They said, we look like grasshoppers compared to them. Well, that's the wrong comparison. That's comparing me to my problem. You ever compared yourself to your problem? You're going to lose that comparison each and every time, because your problem will always be bigger than you. That's why it's a problem. If you were able to handle it, would it be a problem? No. But if we oftentimes compare ourselves to our problems, and we're going to lose that comparison each and every time, and guess what the result will be? Fear. Each and every time. Each and every time. But the right comparison is to compare God to your problems, because God's bigger than your problems. He's going to take care of that. And furthermore, what will be the outcome when we do that? Well, it's going to instill in us confidence, which will lead to victory. And so instead of retreating and running away and not facing it, we're going to see those problems, and we're going to encounter those problems, and we're going to advance past those problems. Well, here's the third lesson that we learn about wandering, and that is this: don't settle for good enough. Don't settle for good enough. So the people were thirsty once again, and God tells Moses to speak to the rock, and water would pour forth. But what does Moses do? We've already established that. He strikes the rock twice with his staff. It says it there in Numbers chapter 20, verses 11 through 13. He struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and the beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron, "Because you have not believed in me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring with this assembly into the land in which I've shown them." Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. Not once, twice, Moses strikes the rock. Why twice? Well, because just speaking to a rock is crazy. And after all, the first time that Moses provided water for the people, he struck the rock and it worked. The very fact that Moses strikes the rock 2 times shows that it wasn't some sort of slip of mine or that I forgot or that it was an accident. It was deliberate on Moses' part, because he was thinking, God, you're telling me to speak to this rock? I don't believe that just speaking to this rock is going to pour forth water. You tell me it's going to. I don't believe it. I don't want to look like an idiot in front of millions of people. So I'm going to go ahead and strike it, because that's what I did before and it worked out so well. And because of his unbelief, because he did what was more familiar and more comfortable, he missed out on the blessings of God. And aren't we guilty of the same things? Sometimes don't we settle for, well, good enough when it comes to God's standards? We look across the fence at our neighbors, or we read the news and we think, well, you know what? I'm not a great Christian, but at least I haven't killed anybody. Well, furthermore, Moses didn't trust God enough, and so he took matters into his own hands, and instead of going to the promised land, totally missed out on the promised land because he wanted to do what he wanted to do. Talk about forfeiting the blessings of God. And I'm telling you, sometimes I forfeit God's blessings because I settle for what I want to do in the moment rather than what God has told me to do in the moment. And so the question I have for you this morning is, what does your sin cost you? What does your disobedience cost you? 3 lessons so far. Get some perspective. Get past the fear. Don't settle for good enough. Here's the 4th and final lesson that I think is important for us to remember, and we learn it from the Israelites, and that is this: remember, you are set apart. The story tells us that while the Israelites were staying at Shittim, that the men began to indulge in sexual depravity with some of the Moabite women. And not only that, but they were also offering sacrifices to the Moabite women's gods. They were eating some of the sacrificial meals. And as the story reports and records, it says that the Israelites, the sons of Israel, became yoked together with Baal. He was their god, their false god. In fact, one guy was so brazen, so bold, that he had the audacity to take one of these Moabite women that he was shacked up with, whatever, and marched her into his tent right there in front of Moses and in front of Phinehas. Phinehas was a priest. Well, Phinehas took care of that by running a spear through both of them. So God sends a plague and a judgment upon the people for this sin of being yoked together with these heathens, and 24,000 people died. What's the lesson that we learn? Well, the lesson that they learned was that God was teaching the Israelites that, look, you are a people who are to be set apart. That even while you're wandering, you're supposed to be my people. You're supposed to be separate, holy. And so too, the lesson for us is that when we go through our journey, as we live life somewhere between where we started and where we want to end up, the lesson is this, that we are called to be separate. And it can be very tempting to be yoked together with the world. It's very easy to skimp on business practices to have a more healthy bottom line. It's very easy to want to change our social stances on things when we're being told that there's a new normal, whether it be homosexual marriages or whether it be living together before you're married. We can think, well, that's kind of the social norm of the day, so maybe I'm backwards on that. It can be very easy to be lax in your parenting, as all of the parents are just kind of letting their kids do whatever they want to do. Jimmy down the street's got a cell phone at the age of 10. Why can't I have a cell phone? It can be very easy to be lax on parenting because of the social standards we find ourselves living in. But look, God has commanded us to stay separate from the rest of the world. I mean, that was one of Jesus' first sermons on the Mount that he's preaching and he's teaching. And he says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, he says this, look, you are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Let your light shine in such a way that when men look at you, they think, wow, there's something different about that guy. There's something different about that girl. I'm going to thank God and I want to live my life like they're living, so that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. The message to the Israelites was to be separate, to be different. That's what they learned in the desert in their wandering. And we should learn that as well. And that's a lesson that's hard to learn sometimes. Look, here's the last point of application. As we're summarizing all of chapter 6 up, here's the thing, that as we're wandering in life, as we're going from where we started to where we want to end up, how are you doing? Are you trusting? Are you obeying? Are you going where God has said to go and doing what God has said to do? Because in that are great blessings. And that leads us to our time decision here this morning. We're going to sing a song that encourages us to do just that, to trust and to obey. Even when we don't understand how it's going to work out, even when we don't understand and have all the answers, trusting and obeying always leads to God's blessing.